On March 15, 1895, in the Irish town of Ballyvadla, Bridget Cleary's body was set on fire. Her husband, Michael Cleary, had set her on fire with 9 other people, including the parish priest. Earlier, that same year, Michael had become convinced that Bridget had been replaced by an exact doppelganger through the work of fairies. A successful businesswoman, a rarity at that time, Bridget had built a business as a dressmaker independently of her husband, while Michael worked in the mine. When they eventually moved in together, Michael hardly recognized the woman that he had married. The two had moved into a large home together. They'd gotten a great deal on it because it was built near a fairy ring fort, which, according to Irish folklore, is bad luck. Bridget's financial and social independence from Michael baffled him, and he quickly began blaming the nearby fairy fort. Soon, Michael started to believe that the woman living in his house wasn't Bridget at all. She was something else. During this time, Michael became suspicious of everything Bridget did. He believed everything that she said was a lie. He didn't believe that her body was hers, and eventually he became consumed and obsessed with this idea. In the final weeks of her life, Bridget fell ill with bronchitis, and after that, Michael started to suspect that the body that the fairies had created for her was breaking down. Michael talked about his suspicions with different men in the town, and together they egged each other on, and eventually Michael became so sure that Bridget was not Bridget that the men got together and killed her. Bridget Cleary went missing in March of 1895. Her body was found burned and mutilated in the woods nearby. Bridget Cleary's murder demonstrates the potential danger of certain psychotic delusions. Michael Cleary, it's usually hypothesized, suffered from Capgras delusion, where somebody close to you that you love, and usually a close friend or a family member, is suspected to be replaced by some kind of doppelganger created by some nefarious institution. Once a person suffers from this delusion, it is nearly impossible to break them out of it. Usually this delusion is caused by some kind of brain lesion or cranial trauma, and it's usually believed that Michael sustained some kind of injury working in the mine, and when he came home, Capgras delusion took over. What's most interesting to me about this case is not necessarily that Michael Cleary suffered from Capgras delusion or that he eventually enacted violence upon his wife. It's that he convinced 9 other people, including his priest, to also accomplish this goal. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about delusions, how delusions can occur, where they come from, and how to maybe avoid them or spot them. In the 1993 release of R.L. Stine's novel Welcome to Camp Nightmare, a young boy named Billy attends a summer camp called Night Moon, where anthropomorphized wolves stalk the campers. When Billy tries to call home, he realizes the phones are fake. They don't make calls, they're just props. As the story goes on, Billy unravels details about the camp which defamiliarize it from the expectations we have about the environment Billy is in. When I first read this novel almost 30 years ago, I was struck by the terrifying realization that you're in an environment you can't trust, that the rules which have always worked for you may not really be rules at all. By the end of the novel, Billy believes his entire life to be some kind of simulation, or a huge conspiracy created specifically for him. The reveal in the final moments is that none of these characters are human, and the planet they're on is not even Earth. At 8 years old, that concept deeply unsettled me. What if the reality you've grown accustomed to, that you've grown dependent upon, suddenly upended itself in ways you never expected? A couple of years later, I saw Peter Weir's 1998 film, The Truman Show. The Truman Show follows Truman Burbank, a man born and raised in a simulated suburb created especially for television audiences. Every person in this town besides Truman is an actor playing a role. Truman's wife, for example, is an actress hired to be Truman's co-star, and as part of the revenue for the show, she is expected to perform ad copy for various brands. Truman slowly realizes over the course of the film that his entire world is fiction, that for Truman, the conspiracy is real. Similarly to Welcome to Camp Nightmare, The Truman Show plays on our fears that we cannot trust our perceived reality. What appears normal to Truman, over time, is weaponized against him for the sake of an audience. For example, early in the film, the producers kill off the actor playing Truman's dad, in part to place a traumatic association with the ocean. That association of trauma with the ocean ensures that Truman won't attempt to sail out toward the matte painting serving as the horizon. But in the third act, when Truman begins to question the world around him, the producers send Truman's father back to pacify him. However, by this point, it's too late. The seed has been planted, and Truman can't undo what he now believes. The Truman Show so expertly lays out these fears that, after the film was released, people who harbor persecutory or grandiose delusions are sometimes labeled as suffering from Truman Show delusion. One of those people is Frank Chu. If you've spent enough time in San Francisco, you've probably seen Frank Chu. Every Monday through Friday, Frank Chu hits the pavement as a professional protester. He's usually on Market or Montgomery Street, but you could have seen him at any number of protests in the area. Frank Chu is interesting because he didn't always have certain delusions. But first, let's talk about why he's protesting. Chu calls himself a protester performer. I don't really know what that means. I guess it might be some sort of performance art or something, but most importantly, this is what Chu does. This is his living. Chu sells ad space on his picket signs, and every Saturday he makes a new sign with different advertisers on the back. It's $100 a week if you're interested in supporting Frank Chu. So Frank Chu went to UC Berkeley, and he was actually an accountant for a few years. Notably, about a year after The Truman Show came out, Frank Chu started to believe that he was different somehow. Over time, Chu started to believe that he was actually the star of a series of television shows that ran from the 60s through the 70s, all shot by hidden cameras. Chu believes that he is owed several decades worth of back pay for being one of the most famous actors to ever live. I know you're thinking, why haven't you heard of him if he's one of the most famous actors? Well, here's the important thing. Frank Chu believes that he is famous, but not necessarily famous on Earth. Frank Chu's delusion is that in 12 separate galaxies all across the universe, Frank Chu is a megastar. He's just not a megastar on Earth. Chu claims that this show was released weekly, and people just learned about the innermost struggles of his life. Like The Truman Show, Frank believes that there were hidden cameras placed all around his house, and that through weekly episodes, people got to learn more and more about him against his will. Throughout 12 separate galaxies, Frank Chu, according to Frank, has become one of the biggest stars in the history of entertainment. And his protests are that he should be getting back pay for being such a famous star. Over the decades, Frank Chu's back pay protest has turned into a bit of its own thing. If you want to do some research on that, you can, but it has evolved and changed over time. Over the decades, the protest has grown to involve not just Chu's back pay, but his delusion is a vast conspiracy set forth by a long list of former US presidents who have used the government and resources of the 12 galaxies to alter Earth's reality. Presidents, such as Ronald Reagan, Grover Cleveland, George W. Bush, Donald Trump, have all been named as co-conspirators in the 12 galaxies. Although, funnily enough, Chu does say that Jimmy Carter is only partly guilty and that Barack Obama's fine. Chu's appearances at protests all around San Francisco have kind of turned him into a celebrity in his own right. A lot of San Francisco natives know him by name and are aware of him. The immediate response you may have to somebody like Frank Chu might be to ridicule him or think he's ridiculous or think he's delusional, and he is, but something to keep in mind is that Frank suffers from a delusion that's very similar to Michael Cleary's, except everyone kind of knows that Frank is doing his own thing. What made Michael so convincing and compelling to people in his area, and what makes Frank Chu so uncompelling by comparison? What is the difference? Part of that difference might have to do with consciousness and our understanding of what things are inherently. Frank Chu seems to understand something integral to the human experience when it comes to our consciousness, and I'm fascinated by it. And so let's go back a little bit to, let's talk about Plato. One of the oldest and most common philosophical theories to explore is Plato's theory of form. You may know this as the cave illustration from Plato's dialogues. The theory of form illustrates that there are real objects and there are these abstract, spiritual, perfect objects. The idea here is that there are real objects that are outside of the cave. The sunlight outside of the cave draws shadows on the cave wall, and everything that we see in our living, waking life is actually a mere shadow of this perfect object outside of the cave. It's usually easier with an example, and this is a pretty famous one. This is a chair. We know it's a chair. Innately, it has so many chair-like qualities that you're probably familiar with. Even if you've never seen this exact chair before, maybe you've seen a similar model. Maybe you went to a chair store and looked at so many chairs that we can sense a certain essence of chair within it. According to Plato, we may look at a chair and recognize certain chair qualities, but what we are looking at in reality is merely a shadow of a chair, an imperfect object that resembles somewhat the abstract, perfect chair outside of the cave. Once you defamiliarize the object, you can then try to reconstruct the exact definition of a chair. What is it really? Does it always have 4 legs, for example? No, like this chair has 3 legs. Does it always have a back? Also no. Is it made exclusively for sitting? How can you tell? Have you talked to the designer? Can you put a plate on the seat of the chair and now call it a table? What about that? Is that a chair? What about this? For Plato, this is how all known reality works. We have some ephemeral, distant, ideal memory of something, and reality is just a series of remembrances and recognitions of those perfect objects that we already have in mind spiritually somewhere out of the cave. The idea of the Platonic ideal has evolved into kind of a sticky series of philosophical queries. For example, take fascism, maybe the darkest example of this. A philosophical approach that expects a certain Platonic ideal from a people group, or a citizen, we should say. For the Third Reich, for example, there was a certain Platonic kind of German. The more you fit that ideal, the more German you were. Not just ideologically, but genetically, philosophically, actually. For something maybe a little less extreme, you can also think about this in terms of, have you ever read a book and you saw the movie adaptation and you were upset the whole time? When there's some kind of casting for a role, the casting is then compared to whatever the audience's Platonic ideal may have been. That anger comes from a certain innate correctness that people have in mind for this particular property. And so when you go against that innate correctness, they get angry or frustrated or sad. So if we move away too much from the Platonic ideal of something, it's possible that we feel some kind of existential sense of grief or loss. To make things more annoying, a pedantic person may point out that this is actually not a chair, this is an image of a chair, sort of like the Rene Magritte example of, this is not a pipe. It's not a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe. This chair, for example, you can't sit in this chair. It's on your screen. I guess you could sit on your screen, maybe, but your screen isn't a chair. I guess it could be a chair. While Plato lived many generations before the scientific study of the mind, he does make an excellent observation about the relationship between the mind and the physical space in which the mind observes. When we see a car, or a sunset, or we hear a voice or a song, we have 2 schools of thought on what we're experiencing. Are you truly interacting with and experiencing that thing, or is our mind giving us a description of that thing? In the same way, Magritte's pipe is not a pipe, or this chair is not a chair. It's possible philosophically that all empirical information gained from our senses are not actually raw data. It's one of the first questions we ask when we start thinking abstractly. Is this color blue the same as somebody else's color blue? When I eat an apple, is there an objective apple flavor, or do other people taste a different flavor, but we were both taught that that flavor is apple? No, let's go back to the Truman Show. How does Truman Burbank learn that he's in a false reality? If it's the magical column of rain just for him, if it's the light that falls from the sky, if it's the circular traffic patterns, the odd advertisement readings delivered seemingly to nobody by his wife, if it's none of these things, then it's also all of these things. Of course, Truman has no other reality to compare this one to. He's only ever lived in this reality. It's not strange for him because these are the platonic shadows he's always seen. It's not until one of the actors for The Truman Show directly tells Truman that he's in a false reality that he starts to recognize the signs for what they are. As human beings, we already seek out patterns and narratives to bring order and logic to our lives. When something awful happens, we want there to be a reason. When something great happens, we seek to find out how we earned or deserved it, or we feel guilty that we didn't. Coincidences, patterns, and novel events connect themselves to each other in the ongoing narrative of our lives. We do the same thing. We expect certain things to happen in some kind of destiny or fate. And when those expectations aren't fulfilled, we experience anxiety, anger, grief, existential dread. For Truman, he just happens to be right. His life is being written. The conspiracy in this case is actually true. The Truman Show actually feeds into what we want most in our lives, which is purpose. We want to believe that these things are written down, that everything does happen for a reason, that the chaos is the illusion, that order is real. In January 1975, science fiction writer Samuel R. Delaney released Dhalgren, his nightmarish magnum opus about a young man who enters the city of Bologna, California, I think, although everything in this book is kind of unclear. He enters Bologna, California, which seems to a city experiencing strange phenomena that have broken down society to a point of anarchy and chaos. The protagonist, a man with no memory of who he is, and is later just called Kid, enters Bologna without any identity or goal. Time is different there. An hour can pass for one person while months pass for the same person in what feels like the same amount of time. There's fog so thick it's impossible to see the skyline or beyond the city itself. It's like you're trapped in there. It's like a sort of a Silent Hill situation. On the rare times that the fog does part, we see two moons, for example. One of the moons is our moon that we all know and love and cherish and is responsible for the tides. And then the other moon is just named George Harrison, after a guy who lives in Bologna, who is not the Beatle, he's a different George Harrison. Sometimes the sun rises and it's normal, and sometimes the sun rises and it is like 30 times bigger than the average sun, and everything turns red and foggy and scary. Gangs roam Bologna. They call themselves Scorpions, and they have these holograms built around them that make them look like different insects and rodents, and I guess they're the government of the town. The protagonist, who is called Kid, although that's not really his name, he's at the center of everything in this city. Like Truman Burbank, everything in this town seems to be for Kid. The Scorpions instinctively follow his lead. Newspaper articles follow his movements like he's a celebrity or a prophet. At one point, he finds a notebook and starts writing poetry in it, and within a couple of days, his poetry is published for everybody to read. Also, in this notebook, there are some pages that are already filled out, and those pages are pages from the book we are reading. Every person Kid meets falls deeply in love with him and will follow him to the ends of the earth. But most importantly, time itself is strange in Bologna. It moves across weeks or months, seemingly overnight. Seasons are inconsistent. It could be summer and winter and fall and summer again, all in the same day. Most importantly, time is not consistent between characters. There are moments where Kid will go into another room and do something, and then he'll come right back and months have passed. The person's beard is longer. The person has aged visibly. This strange dilution and distinction of time reflects Kid's singular experience. He's totally isolated from everybody else in the world, not just mentally or even physically, but dimensionally. The city seems to be a literal representation of Plato's cave theory. Nobody can agree on the shadows on the walls. Bologna is shrouded in layers of mystery. Characters enter and leave at random. Time is impossible to keep track of, and every time we feel like we understand the unique rules of the city, they all change again. Dhalgren is a long novel. It's about 800 pages. It follows the same circular loop as James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. The final sentence of Dhalgren is the first half of the first sentence of Dhalgren, which ends the last sentence on the first page. So in theory, you can start the book at any point and it wraps back around on itself. The novel, in essence, traps you inside of it. You have to decide you are done with the book because the book will never be done with you. Kid is experiencing a hero's journey, but it's a passive one. The hero's journey seems to be happening to him, not the other way around. Like Frank Chu, he seems to live in a world that was constructed for him, that is pushing him through it. Like Truman Burbank, Kid's story is a conspiracy. The other people in his life seem to have crafted a space in which he is forced to live inside of his delusions. Like Michael Cleary, the delusion is able to flourish and evolve because of the involvement of the people around him. Inception is a 2010 science fiction action film centering around a man named Cobb, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. Cobb is a professional thief who steals ideas from people's dreams. He does this by infiltrating the subconscious of his targets. At one point, he is offered a job by a man named Saito to investigate a competitor's brain, and instead of stealing a secret, a trade secret of some kind, he is told to implant an idea that will later break up his company. Cobb accepts the offer and assembles a team, and the team's job is to create a conspiracy inside of a person's brain to convince them of a reality that's not actually true. The act of inception, which is what it's called to implant that idea into the other person's brain, is made possible by the team he has created and by creating a compelling narrative for their target, Robert, played by Cillian Murphy, to believe in. Ariadne is there to construct a world. Eames creates characters to populate that world. Arthur solves problems and ensures everything runs smoothly, and Cobb, who is the director-conductor of this dream, is tasked with creating a believable narrative structure for Robert to fall in. In other words, they have constructed an entire Truman Show-esque world in which Robert will then fall into a trap of believing an idea that is not actually central to his own experience. The heist is built on creating a believable delusion for a person to fall into. In The Truman Show, an actual functioning town is created to support one man's narrative for a general audience, but in Inception, it is creating a mental narrative for someone to fall into. It is both sides of Plato's cave. We have the Truman Show, which seems to be outside of the cave, and then we have Robert's brain, which is the inside. Or maybe it's the other way around. And all of this might seem crazy. It might seem like nobody would ever fully believe in these constructed worlds. But the funny thing is, on a smaller scale, we have actually done this experiment before with other people. This is Matt Kennedy Gould. In 2002, he was spotted playing basketball at his local Jewish community center by talent scouts looking for somebody to compete on a new reality show called Lap of Luxury. Lap of Luxury was entering its first season for Spike TV. The goal of the show was to pit competitors against each other in a series of increasingly tedious and hilarious challenges and events, and the winner would receive $100,000 in a cash prize. The show was filled with distinct personalities we've become accustomed to seeing in these kinds of shows. There's a hero, a villain, a mean girl, a jock, that kind of thing. Within this mix, Matt Kennedy Gould is sort of the everyman, I guess, kind of a Joe Schmo figure. A lot of strange things happen throughout the show, but nothing really outside of the realm of the kinds of things you would see on like Real World Road Rules back in the day, or Big Brother, or early seasons of Survivor. However, as the show continues, things do get stranger and stranger, and Gould is much more the focus of these events than you would initially believe. That is, if you didn't already know the premise of the show that I'm talking about. Lap of Luxury isn't actually a show. It's a fake show. Matt Kennedy Gould is actually the target of a wide conspiracy set forth for him, called The Joe Schmo Show. Every part of Lap of Luxury has been carefully scripted and constructed around Matt Kennedy Gould. Everybody is in on the joke except for him. This show came out in 2003 and was obviously created with The Truman Show in mind. They literally have the same naming convention. And ethics aside, The Joe Schmo Show's first season is an interesting experiment in coercion and psychological terror. But what's really interesting is that no matter how strange things become in the Lap of Luxury show within a show, Gould never really takes a moment to question the reality of what's happening to him. Like Truman Burbank, Gould is so immersed in the lie of another person's construction that it simply never occurs to him to question the reality that he is in. And by far the show's most famous moment, Gould is presented with the truth of Lap of Luxury and the hoax that he is inside of, and as each person he has befriended slowly reveals themselves to be an actor in disguise, Gould yells this.
What is going on? What is going on?
This moment became so integral to the history of the show and of Spike TV in general that the line was included as part of the Spike TV logo at the end of all the original programming. One man's existential nightmare, another man's cash cow. The fourth season is in production now. More recently, an Amazon freebie show called Jury Duty pulled the same trick on the unsuspecting Ronald Gladden. Like The Joe Schmo Show, Jury Duty's producers told Ronald that he was part of a documentary chronicling the average jury duty experience in America. But in reality, the show is an expansive fictional narrative constructed around Ronald. The biggest difference between The Joe Schmo Show and Jury Duty is really just timing. While internet forums did exist in 2003, 20 years later, social media really exploded people's ability to watch and talk about a show. Armchair psychologists all over the globe started to pick apart both the psychological impact this experience may have had on Ronald and the ethical implications of doing such a thing to a person. Another, larger demographic was women who seemed to fall in love with Ronald because he's genuinely very sweet and affable, and he is weirdly compelling and nice in the central role of this show. Commenters loved pointing out where they would have realized that they were on a fictional show, pointing out, strange behaviors and occurrences between characters. Some people pointed out how Ronald seems naive. They would ask themselves, how could this man not realize he's the center of some elaborate hoax? The obvious counterpoint to this question is that every viewer of Jury Duty knows what Jury Duty's main premise is. So they immediately have context and therefore an upper hand on Ronald when it comes to what they're being presented. It's like a person who has seen 10 seasons of Law & Order being excited for themselves for being able to predict who the killer is. Yeah, you've seen 10 seasons. You understand Law & Order. It's going to be the guy who's looking through his file cabinet 2 minutes in. What's happening to Ronald is not a thing that happens to normal people really any of the time in their lives. He would have no reason to question anything that's happening to him. In most cases, questioning the fabric of your reality is something delusional people do. Like Matt Kennedy Gould, Ronald is subjected to increasingly unbelievable events over the course of the show, but Ronald never questions the nature of the reality he's in. He simply believes correctly that the world is a strange place full of strange people and that strange things happen sometimes. Our brains rarely question reality itself, but instead the actions happening within it. That's why Michael Cleary's Capgras is so dangerous. Questioning the very nature of your reality places you outside of it, and because you are outside of it, nobody inside of it can convince you otherwise. For Plato, all of reality was a shadow of some inherent conceptual truth, but the ways in which that belief manifests is very different in our day-to-day lives. It's simply counterproductive to live your life like everything you see and do is some imperfect copy of some ideological perfect truth. The most practical way to engage with life is under the assumption that you're being presented with the truth and that all reality is in fact reality. It takes somebody else telling Truman Burbank that his life is a lie that he starts to see the lie for what it is. Michael Cleary's friends lived in a world without fairies until his delusion persuaded them to question reality. Frank Chu, however, continues to struggle to convince others of his delusion. The problem is Frank Chu's delusions are too divorced from any known structure. For Michael Cleary, his delusions involved the cultural mythology of fairies, which is something that the people he lived with already had experience believing. And so it's not that far outside the realm of possibility for Michael Cleary's associates to eventually believe that the Irish folklore of fairies was in fact true. Frank Chu is a man most people have never met, talking about a TV show nobody has seen, that aired in other galaxies nobody's ever heard of. So Frank Chu's delusions are dangerous mostly only to himself, but few others. In the world of Inception, the heist wouldn't work when using Frank Chu's logic. It's too extreme. For Inception's central heist to work, Cobb has to create or recreate feelings that his target already inherently understands. When Matt Gould was hired to appear on Lap of Luxury, there was already a series of shows portraying similar challenges and characters. In that era of reality TV, we had The Real World Road Rules, we had Big Brother and Survivor. Those are already several seasons deep at that point. Each of these shows had characters just like the ones that were in Lap of Luxury. So Gould would have no incentive to question the reality of what was happening to him. If a character was walking around the Lap of Luxury set in full alien costume and speaking some alien language, Gould may have then started to have some suspicions. What makes a novel like Samuel R. Delaney's Dhalgren so fascinating is that Bologna is a city that canonically is integrated into the known United States. He travels there from San Francisco in the mid-1970s. The events within the town are so disjointed from realism that kids' acceptance of each level of the surreal creates a vast divide between the reader and the protagonist. In this way, Kid is much closer to Frank Chu than somebody like Matt Kennedy Gould. Why would Kid assume these impossible events are only occurring in this town? How would that even make sense? Furthermore, the people sometimes don't even believe Kid's observations when they are around him. Half the people that he talks to don't even believe that there are two moons. For this reason, it's more likely and more accurate that Kid himself is experiencing these delusions and he is trying to convince others of the same. Kid's acceptance that time, physical space, and cosmology are all unique in this one location demonstrate how Dhalgren is perhaps the reverse of the Truman Show. Instead of others manufacturing a world for Kid, for example, he seems to have manufactured a world for everybody else. Because Dhalgren is so long, and because both its language and its content are so tied specifically to a character's experience, it may be one of the most convincing and accurate portrayals of a delusion so strong that it borders on dangerous contagion. In fact, before writing this novel, Samuel R. Delaney experienced an unspecified existential delusion so damaging to his life that he was hospitalized for a period of time. Kid reveals throughout the novel that he, too, has experienced hospitalization for similar kinds of delusion. The murder of Bridget Cleary is a real-life example of how delusions can be dangerous and contagious for those who lose the sense of time and reality. The murder of Bridget Cleary stands as a real-life example of how delusions can be dangerous and contagious for those who lose sense of the difference between the real and the abstract. Film, television, and other media use fiction as a delivery system for abstract or conceptual truths, mere shadows of real life that hint at the reality casting the light. But sometimes these stories depict those who confuse the truth with their observation. What happens when your senses deceive you, your logic fails you, and your perspective leaves you ignorant of the larger truth? In future videos, I'm going to perform a deep dive on the BBC's Ghostwatch broadcast and the work of Nathan Fielder. These are just more complicated and nuanced examples that are gonna have to just have their own video. Thank you for watching. It really means a lot that you made it this far into the video. Please consider subscribing and waiting for more videos to come in the future.